In 1837, Danish author Hans Christian Andersen wrote a fairy tale that will almost certainly sound familiar to you. See if you can understand why, because it goes a little something like this. Deep below the water, there was a fantastical sea kingdom, and in this kingdom there were 6 princesses. The youngest of these, a little mermaid with red hair, was fascinated with the world above. The mermaid would pester her grandmother to tell her all she knew of the ships and towns and people above the water. When you have reached your 15th year, her grandmother told her, you will have permission to rise up to the surface and see for yourself. But the mermaid sighed, for she was still only 10 years old. Each year, she watched as one of her sisters would turn 15, swim to the surface, and discover some new wonder to regale the others about. They would speak of the beauty of the stars or the sunset or the birds, but after a month or so, they would inevitably grow tired and prefer to just stay underwater, where they felt it was more beautiful. Finally, it came the turn of the youngest princess, and on her first night of being 15, she eagerly swam up to the surface and happened upon a large ship, which was bustling with song and dance. Fascinated, the little mermaid watched the people and, one in particular, a handsome young prince who was currently celebrating his 16th birthday. The mermaid watched on, enamored by the handsome prince, until a terrible storm hit the ship, flinging it onto its side. The mermaid saw the prince get thrown into the water by the waves and quickly sprung into action, diving deep to save him and take him safely to shore. As she laid the prince down on the white sand, she wished she could stay with him, but upon hearing the nearby church bells, she hid herself between some rocks and watched as a young girl came to check on the prince and then promptly brought more people back to help bring him to life. Sad that the prince didn't know it was she who saved him, the mermaid became more and more fascinated with the handsome boy. She went to her grandmother and asked, if human beings don't drown, can they live forever? To which her grandmother replies, well, humans have shorter lives than ours actually. We sometimes live to 300 years, but when we cease to exist, we only become foam on the surface of the water. Human beings, however, have a soul which lives forever. Feeling jealous of this, the mermaid asks, is there anything I can do to win an immortal soul? To which her grandmother tells her that if you can make a man love you so much that he forgets about everyone else and takes you to be his bride, he would then give you his soul while keeping his own. But this can never happen because human beings would find your tail to be ugly and you need to have legs to be considered beautiful. Determined now to acquire this immortal soul which sounds so awesome, the mermaid seeks out the sea witch, who lives in a creepy underwater forest. I know what you want, the witch says upon the mermaid's arrival. It is very stupid of you, but you shall have it your way, and it will bring you sorrow. The witch tells her that she can give her a potion which will replace her tail with 2 legs, but while she will be a graceful and beautiful woman, every step she takes will bring her immense pain, as if she were treading on sharp knives. And if the prince doesn't love her completely, she will never have an immortal soul. The morning after he marries another, she will perish and become foam on the crest of the waves. Still, the mermaid agrees, and as compensation for the potion, the witch asks for the mermaid's beautiful voice. When the mermaid accepts this price, the witch cuts out her tongue and keeps it for herself. But now with potion in hand, the mermaid rushes up to the prince's palace, drinks the potion, and passes out. When she awakes, she finds her handsome prince stood staring at her and asking who she is. The mermaid felt sad that she couldn't answer, but it didn't matter because soon she was being whisked away to the prince's palace. From this point on, she grew closer and closer to the prince. She would dance for him better than anyone he had ever seen, even though indeed each step felt like she was treading on sharp knives. She slept at his door on a velvet cushion that they put on the floor, and yet, as the days passed, the prince did not seem to want to marry her. He explained that there was this young maiden who belonged to the holy temple, who he thinks saved him when he nearly drowned at sea. She was the only one in the world he could love, although he knows they will never meet again. Then one day, the prince was to travel to the neighboring kingdom to meet with the young princess that his parents wanted him to marry, and the mermaid went with him. The prince assured her that his parents would not force him to marry this maiden. But as soon as the princess appeared, the prince immediately declared, "It was you who saved my life when I lay dead on the beach," and he rushed to take his new bride into his arms. That night, the mermaid cared for nothing, for not only was she heartbroken, but she knew that the morning would bring her death. But as the married couple retreated to their tent, the mermaid gazed out into the sea and saw her sisters rising out of the water. "We have given our hair to the witch in exchange for this knife," they tell her. "If you plunge this knife into the prince's heart before sunrise, you will once more become a mermaid and live out your 300 years before you die and change into sea salt foam." Quietly, with knife in hand, the mermaid snuck into the prince's tent and gazed upon him lying with his sleeping bride. But as the mermaid kissed the prince's forehead, she could not bring herself to carry out the deed, and instead she flung the knife into the water before jumping in herself. She was prepared to meet her end, but as the morning sun rose and she thought she was being turned into sea foam, she instead found herself floating into the air. She saw in the sky hundreds of transparent, beautiful beings and felt that she too had now become one of them. "Where am I?" she asked, with a voice that sounded ethereal. "Among the daughters of the air," replied one of them. "A mermaid has not an immortal soul, but the daughters of the air can, by their good deeds, procure one for themselves. We fly to warm countries and cool the sultry air that brings with it pestilence. We carry the perfume of flowers to spread health and restoration. And after we have striven for 300 years, we receive an immortal soul. It may be even sooner, because unseen, we can enter the houses of men, and for every day we find a good child, we can count one less year of our 300. But when we find a naughty or wicked child, we shed tears of sorrow. For every tear, a day is added to our time of trial." And so the mermaid smiled, seeing that she now finally had a path to that which she craved the most, an immortal soul. She kissed the forehead of the prince's bride and fanned the prince before she rose to a cloud in the air and floated through the ether. The end. Okay, deep breath and pause. Hearing the story, and that ending in particular, you might be confused to hear that anyone has ever resonated with any of it, but indeed, this fairy tale has been adapted many times over in films and TV shows. Most famously, and most importantly for this video, by Disney with The Little Mermaid, and by Studio Ghibli with Ponyo, which creator Hayao Miyazaki said was inspired by this Danish story. Now, Disney and Ghibli get compared all the time, and I've done so myself in videos, but never has there been a more appropriate time to do it than when both animation houses adapt the same story. If you've seen both films, you can probably already tell a few big differences in how they approach this source material. But there are some truly fascinating and unexpected choices that each company made, and when we dive into them, I think you'll understand exactly why Disney is Disney and Studio Ghibli is Studio Ghibli. So to understand these films and truly deep dive into them, we need to talk about American President Ronald Reagan, tsunamis, and Christian morality. But first, we need to start by quoting someone exceedingly relevant to the topic, the smarmiest man in history, Oscar Wilde. If you know anything about the works of author, playwright, and poet Oscar Wilde, you'll know that he is not someone whose words should ever be taken at face value. But there is a quote from his book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, that summarizes well what we are going to talk about. One of the characters, a painter named Basil, says the following line after making a portrait that he is scared to show others. "Every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not of the sitter. It is not he who is revealed by the painter, it is rather the painter who on the colored canvas reveals himself." I think there is some truth to this. When someone makes a creative piece, they are often revealing something about themselves, whether consciously or subconsciously. And in the choices they make, Hans Christian Andersen, Studio Ghibli, and Disney are all revealing something about themselves. All three start with the same premise, a fish who longs to become human. But where they each go reveals so much about the culture and mentality that they created the story in. Let's start with the source work. Andersen was writing in Europe in the 1800s. This was a time when religion was the be-all and end-all, and Andersen himself felt his faith was very important to him. To that end, his original Little Mermaid is really about religion. The sea princess's love for the human prince is there, but it's secondary to her desire for an immortal soul, which of course is something that is really important in Christian theology. If you're a good person, your soul is sent to heaven, and that's something all Christians are supposed to aspire to. If you look at the mermaid's actions, she seeks out the sea witch not because she's in love with the prince and wants to be with him, but actually because she wants him to give her part of his soul through marriage, and then be immortalized in the afterlife. To that end, she achieves her goal when she forsakes killing the prince and instead sacrifices herself, much like Jesus Christ. As a reward, she is made one of the children of the air and promised that if she keeps at it for 300 years, she will eventually be granted entry to heaven. So the story really, as critic Jack Snipes puts it in his book The Enchanted Screen, The Unknown History of Fairy Tale Films, it is a Christian conversion story based on a miracle. The pagan girl learns all about Christian love and devotion. Of course, there's an added lesson for the reader, and particularly children, that when children are good, these spirits are brought closer to entering heaven. When they are bad, these spirits are kept in this limbo state for longer. Therefore, children should be good. So for Andersen, the story is a vehicle for pushing Christian morality to his readers and show how the devotion to God should be put above anything else. Now compare this to Disney's Little Mermaid. This is a film made in the late 1980s in America, a country that is famously all about free will and individual autonomy. And so this, accordingly, is a story about selfish desires and successfully getting them met. Gone are their messages about devotion to God and Christ-like self-sacrifice, and instead, Ariel sees her prince, wants him, and eventually gets him, even if that meant forsaking her home and the life she's known. In this story, you can even say that the self is now God. The only thing you need to be beholden to is your own desires, and that is the philosophy one should follow. Then we find Studio Ghibli's Ponyo, which is coming from 21st century Japan and stands somewhere in the middle of these opposite beliefs in something greater than the self versus believing in the self. Ponyo, like Ariel, is very rebellious and to some extent selfish, prioritizing her own desires over everything else. But the film overall also has a wider social message, one that is impossible to miss: the power, sanctity, and importance of the natural world. While there is no God to fear or worship, the idea of a nature being thrown off balance is the thing that everyone in the movie fears and feels the consequences of. Ponyo and Sosuke's love basically threatens to destroy the world, and this balance is only restored when Ponyo is made fully human, gives up her powers, and Sosuke promises to love her forever. So nature becomes this almost supernatural force that needs to be taken care of and appeased. By giving up her powers, Ponyo doesn't please her chosen love or even divine morality, she pleases the natural order, restoring the world to balance and saving the day for everyone, both above and below water. But in analyzing the messages of our two films, we can go even deeper than that. First, to understand Disney's film, we need to understand the social landscape of the 1980s in America. The Little Mermaid released just as the Ronald Reagan era came to an end, a time when social upheaval and unrest was spiking in a massive way. Reaganomics, an economic policy that saw power rapidly drain from the majority and wealth concentrated into the hands of the elite, came alongside the war on drugs, which again targeted poor black communities in particular. Riots, protests, and fear-mongering were a huge part of the news media landscape, and it's in response to all of this that we get The Little Mermaid, a film where absolutely nothing unexpected happens if you've ever seen a Disney film before. The film is formulaic not by accident or laziness, but by design. After a decade of social unrest, Disney wanted to give audiences something that would show them a world that is familiar and safe. As Jack Snipes puts it in his book, the 1970s had been a decade of instability, violence, and social upheaval, and the rise of mass movements for social reform. The 1980s began turning back the clock. By 1989, even though the unromantic George Bush was in power, America was back in the romance mode. And a film for the family, especially a Disney film, that might deal with religion, suicide, and death would not only have been a commercial failure, it would have been sinful and not in keeping with Disney corporate practices. And so, even though rebellion is the ostensible theme at the start of The Little Mermaid, by the end, we swing back hard the other way, with the social order being even more in alignment than it was before. The dark-skinned, evil upstart witch who threatened to bring social upheaval with her is killed by our heroic prince. And at the end, not one but two kingdoms find themselves happier than they were before. The human kingdom can finally be assured that Prince Eric has settled down, ensuring a continued succession of his royal line. And King Triton and the Sea Kingdom can be happy that they finally sorted out the future of the previously unruly and rebellious Princess Ariel. Now let's compare this to Ponyo, where, as we said, there's this overarching theme about nature. But in the same way that American society has its own anxieties that The Little Mermaid is responding to, so too does Ponyo respond to the anxieties of Japanese society, namely in the form of natural disasters. It's hard to generalize and compare cultures in broad strokes. We can be pretty accurate about observations and trends in American society because it's the most scrutinized and discussed culture in the world, with the vast majority of globally relevant media giving us a deep insight into it. However, with Japanese culture, especially when looking at it from a Western perspective, things can be a bit more distant and sometimes misunderstood. The one thing I feel pretty safe in saying is that stoicism is a much more common cultural approach in Japan. Tsunamis, earthquakes, and other natural events have been a part of life for Japanese people for as long as the islands have been inhabited. And so people take a much more holistic approach to the whole idea. That's not to say that it isn't painful or traumatizing to be a victim of a natural disaster, but it is much more an inevitable part of life for Japanese people rather than a freak occurrence. It's more of a question of when, where, and how bad rather than if. To illustrate this point, only a few years after Ponyo was released, Japan was hit with a major tsunami in 2003, which devastated those affected. So accordingly, while Ponyo focuses on love and rebellion, it's also strongly engaged in the idea of life after a natural disaster. The town is, after all, completely submerged underwater by the end of the film. But interestingly, Miyazaki's perspective isn't one that's negative or fear-mongering. If anything, it's rather optimistic. For starters, even though the town is submerged, nothing actually appears damaged. As if by magic, well, actually it is a magical tsunami, none of the buildings look to be broken or destroyed by the water. Instead, they stay in this stasis state, resting peacefully as if ready to resume right afterwards. The townspeople as well do not panic. They don't despair, and far from turning on one another in a frenzy, the only thing they care about after the tsunami is to check on each other, to form little communities and rescue parties to ensure that everyone in the town is safe and provided for. So, in the same theme as the original of accepting a more powerful force than yourself, you could say that Ponyo is showing what an idealized version of Japanese society might wish and want for in the aftermath of a natural disaster. But of course, this is the big picture we're talking about. There's a lot more to both of these films in the details of what they depict and in what their characters represent. So let's talk about perhaps the most obvious difference, the age of our characters. Okay, I'm just gonna flat out say it. I think Studio Ghibli's decision to have Sosuke and Ponyo be kids is a lot more effective a love story than the Disney choice to have Ariel and Eric be 16 and 18. The most straightforward reason is that the particulars of teenagehood bring in the cloudy question of lust as a motivation as opposed to the purity of the love between two children. Many scholars and commentators have spoken about how Ariel's love for Prince Eric is really just sexual lust. Critic Sarah Shoker puts it like this: Ariel spends much of The Little Mermaid lusting after Prince Eric's body. She wants to be human, wants their legs, to know what it feels like to walk. Eric is a prince, but he's also a body that is imbued with symbolism. He's not only Eric, but a representation of everything she wants. She gushes over him, and once she saves Eric from the peril of the sea and returns him to land, pauses to admire him, leaving no question that her crush is based on sexual desire. And if you want further confirmation that sexuality is a factor that Disney were thinking about, consider the fact that they deliberately aged up Ariel from 15 to 16 and Eric from 16 to 18 so that they were both of the age of consent. Now, sexuality is not inherently a bad thing. As Shoka herself points out in her article, physical desire is a normal human impulse and is not something that Ariel should be criticized for in of itself. She is totally valid for wanting to bone Prince Eric. But that also doesn't change the fact that it makes the whole thing seem a lot less meaningful and potentially even doomed to fail. Decisions made for lust are definitely not as sound, powerful, or narratively compelling as a decision made for true love, as anyone who has responded to a 2 a.m. "Are you up?" text will attest to. But it's not just the lust that Ariel has for Eric that adds in this sexual undertone to the film. The whole movie is very obsessed with physical bodies and sexual attractiveness. Of course, the core plot point of the film is about wanting a different body than your own, but the way Ariel's body is presented to us is also very voyeuristic. As critic Jackie Mahoney points out in her article, everything that Ariel wears defines her as an object of desire. For the better part of the movie, Ariel is clad in nothing more than a very precariously placed seashell bra and tail. Her tail and bra serve not as functional pieces of clothing that add to Ariel's character, but rather make her ideal figure, small waist, large breasts, and overall thinness, more apparent. It is this perfect figure and long flowing hair that make her the perfect fetish. She's the ideal woman in every possible way, and the fact that the movie focuses so much more on how beautiful she is rather than any of the characteristics of her personality makes Ariel that much more of an object, specifically an object to be looked at pleasurably. I think the best example of this point comes when Ariel goes up to the surface and gets her human legs. As she accustomizes herself to this new body, the camera is constantly dancing around exposing her private parts. Here, it's her hair that barely covers her while her bare ass sort of pokes out. After that, her crotch is kept just out of shot, first from above, then from below, and finally, when she falls, there's another shot where she's threatening to stand up and expose herself when she emerges from the water, only for the camera to cut away just in time. It all contributes to this sense of trying to titillate audiences by dancing around exposing the most intimate part of her body. But it's not just Ariel's body that is given this treatment. In many ways, Prince Eric has it just as bad, because while he isn't physically put on display the way Ariel is, his body is treated with far less consent in the film. Firstly, there's the contract that Ariel signs, which hinges on eliciting a kiss from Eric. And so immediately, we as audience members watching from Ariel's perspective are demanding his body without his knowledge or consent. Then there's the scene that occurs when Ariel and Eric go on a boat ride. Here Sebastian and Scuttle, Ariel's lobster and seagull friends, try to woo Eric into being romantic with Ariel. But as Sebastian starts singing, the whole scene takes this really fascinating middle space between being diegetic and non-diegetic. On the one hand, we are to understand that Sebastian is really making music right now, using the wildlife and environment around him, but at the same time, Eric also seems to audibly remark that he's not really sure if he's hearing something or not. So ultimately, we are to conclude that he can't tell that this lobster is actually making music and singing to him. Either way, what Sebastian says is really telling, because the lyrics to the song he's singing are "You want to kiss the girl." The way it's all done makes it feel like it's a command he's giving Eric, and not trying to help Eric realize what he really feels for Ariel. It's like he's trying to hypnotize, or at the very least, plant ideas in Eric's head that aren't currently there. And while I'm not saying that he's being forced to do something he doesn't want to do, the question of manipulation is very least on the table. It's like Eric as a person doesn't seem to matter here, or for most of the film, really. Particularly for Ariel's friends, all they care about is getting his body to kiss hers. His desires, his will, even his existence as a living, breathing human are all irrelevant. Just kiss the girl. You want to kiss the girl. Of course, later on, Eric is literally hypnotized and manipulated by Ursula into nearly marrying her, who again uses him more as an object and a means to her evil ends rather than caring about him as a person at all. Ariel's voice is a big part of this manipulation too, and I came across an interesting fan theory on Reddit while researching this video that said that considering the mythos of mermaids and sirens, whose songs were thought to hypnotize and lure sailors to their deaths, Ariel singing for Eric is likely to have had a magic effect in of itself, explaining why he's so obsessed with her voice in particular and not the person he actually meets and spends time with. Not until he's able to tie that voice back to her body. Now let's compare all of this to Ponyo, a film where none of these themes ever even rear their heads. Obviously, with the story centering on little children, the physicality of their love is never brought into question. Instead, I think it elevates this idea into something really pure. It's a love that isn't predicated on anything. Unlike Ariel's fixation on Eric's body, or Eric's obsession with Ariel's voice, Sosuke and Ponyo love each other no matter what. Sosuke is an active and equal part of the romance, firstly, while Eric is mostly projected onto, and the bond between the children is established very early on in Ponyo, as opposed to The Little Mermaid, where Eric loving Ariel is held in doubt right until the very end. On top of that, Sosuke loves Ponyo through all her various forms. He loves her when she's just a fish, he loves her when she's a human girl, and he loves her in all the various hybrid forms she takes in between. Where The Little Mermaid is a film about attraction and infatuation, Ponyo is a film about devotion and constancy, I think. It's a film about what future generations, represented by the two child characters, can do when they stand united and have a shared love of the earth. Together, Ponyo and Sosuke are able to overcome everything. And it's never really a doubt of, do they love each other? The doubt is about the state of the very world, which they save in the end through their complete dedication to one another. In a powerful metaphor, they're able to fix a climate disaster with their love. I think another interesting comparison point this brings up is what the female protagonists go through for that love. Famously, of course, Ariel gives up her tail, her family, and most significantly her voice in order to get a chance at seducing Eric. The fact that her voice is considered her most exceptional attribute and that she gives that up is of course something commentators have analyzed, defended, and criticized in buckets. I'm not going to wade into all of that because truly that's the topic of an entirely separate video essay. But I think it's undeniable to say that giving up this talent of hers and her very ability to express her own thoughts and desires is something that is a net loss for Ariel. Now, a trait like this is built into the genre conventions of fairy tales. Frequently, a character will make a magical deal by seemingly giving up something relatively minor but it ends up proving to be the very thing that brings about their downfall. They're also usually warned repeatedly about the folly of their choice and follow through regardless, only to regret it at the end. In the Danish original, the Sea Witch doesn't trick the Little Mermaid into a contract that she intends to later manipulate, as Ursula does. She very openly warns her that this is a foolish request she is making. But the mermaid makes the deal anyways, and later suffers for the fact that, without her voice, she cannot tell her prince that she is the one who saved him, and so the girl who finds the prince by the beach is instead taken as his savior, and she is the one he ends up marrying. Usually, this is where we're hit with the moral lesson of the fairy tale. To sum it up in one phrase, be careful what you wish for. They are often stories about the folly of wishing for magical solutions to your problems, or wanting things you shouldn't want. In Andersen's fairy tale, it's also used as a reminder that God should be the primary focus of a person's love and desires. In Ponyo though, what's interesting is that Ponyo actually gains things, rather than losing them, as she becomes more human. In her original form, Ponyo is unable to speak and bound to water, needing to be carried around in a bucket by Sosuke at the start of the film. But after drinking his blood and taking in the magic potion that her father was making, she becomes more human. And the more human Ponyo becomes, the more full a version of herself she becomes. She's able to talk, run, eat, and generally enjoy life a lot more thanks to her humanity. And so the choice to become human and live with Sosuke forever is actually just a net gain for Ponyo. She becomes her most fully realized self. There is one thing that she has to give up at the end, her powers, so that she can restore the balance of the natural world. But I'd argue that not having magical powers is very much built into being human. So Ponyo is not asked to give up something that another human could take for granted, like her voice or being able to walk without it feeling like you were stepping on knives. Instead, she is brought on equal terms with Sosuke. She has everything that he has. In the case of Ariel, of course, she is very much asked to give away the best parts of herself to be with Eric. Now you could argue that this is a powerful metaphor about sacrifice for true love, and you may view it as empowering rather than regressive. That Ariel makes an informed choice to give up parts of herself to gain something she values even more highly. But in true Disney fashion, this decision is kind of made irrelevant anyways at the end because she gets to have her cake and eat it too. Ariel gets her voice back, she gets the guy, and her father is able to magically give her feet, something he apparently was able to do all along. This then is probably a good time to discuss the other major difference in the films, the role that fathers play. Now in the Andersen original, the Sea King plays almost no role in the events of the story, but in the genre conventions of animated films, father figures and disapproving father figures are almost always a big part of the plot, especially when it comes to Disney. I've spoken in previous videos about how Disney films, unlike Ghibli films, almost always feature unsupportive father figures who act as obstacles to their children's desires. But children aren't the only thing you can support. For example, you can support your favorite video essay maker. Yes, that is correct. If you enjoy content like this and want to see more of it, without being hit with ads for some weird product you almost certainly should not purchase, then you can do so now with the links in the video description and pinned comment. Seriously though, these video essays take a long time to make, and this channel is entirely funded by support from viewers just like you. Yes, you watching this video right now. Up until this point, I have taken no sponsorships in any of my videos, despite various shady offers. And if I can make ends meet without doing so, then I would like to keep it that way. I want these videos to be authentic, and I certainly don't want to weaponize any goodwill you have for this channel in order to get you to buy things that I'm being paid to flog to you. So if you'd like to help keep this channel this way, then I'd really appreciate it if you would consider pledging a monthly amount on Patreon, and you can get yourself a bunch of benefits in turn, such as your name in the end credits or being part of our monthly supporter call. Alternatively, if you'd prefer a one-time donation, then the link to PayPal is also provided below. As always, I'm very grateful that you've watched my content at all, and if you'd like to watch me stream some video games, and my current obsession is Final Fantasy XIV, then you can come join my live stream here, or hop into our Discord server and join in our lovely discussions with fellow media nerds. Now, back to the video. Now in line with the Disney formula, and in exception to the Ghibli formula, both The Little Mermaid and Ponyo feature disapproving father figures who get in the way of their daughter's desires to be free and live amongst humans. But how both films handle these characters is also illustrative of what they want to say. Let's talk about King Triton first. He's a bit of a complicated and problematic figure. On the one hand, we're meant to know and feel as the audience that he is a benevolent and beloved ruler of his kingdom. Sebastian's song Under the Sea, which is an obvious banger, paints a picture of how happy and harmonious the underwater world is, although we could say he's an unreliable narrator. And yet what we do see of Triton portrays him as rash, mistrusting, and even violent. His most prominent act in the film, apart from assigning Sebastian as a spy/babysitter for Ariel, comes when he finds Ariel's treasure trove of trinkets from the surface. In a moment of pure rage, he uses his almighty magic to destroy basically everything that Ariel holds dear. Now we're meant to view this as the well-intentioned, if somewhat heavy-handed act of a protective father. But it's one of the bleakest scenes in the film, I feel. I think in a real-life context, an angry parent walking into their child's room and smashing every toy they have in some violent rage would be unilaterally seen as abusive behavior. But somehow, in a Disney film, it's just something we're meant to look past when assessing this man. Of course, later we do see that Triton is full of regrets for his actions, repeating out loud, "What have I done?" But this is also the same scene where he orders his seahorse lieutenant to let no one in the kingdom get any rest until Ariel is found. So it's hard not to view Triton as an absolute tyrant of a king and father who rules purely on egotistical whims. It also raises the question of Ursula's position. Why is she banished? What beef does she have with Triton? And if he is such a tyrant, maybe Ursula has a point for rejecting his rule. Sadly, these ideas are never meaningfully explored in the film, and instead, Ursula is portrayed as the true villain, shown to be deceptive and conniving, and completely power-hungry when she does get a hold of Triton's trident. We're meant to come away with feeling like the good ruler is in charge at the end. Now, in contrast to this, Ponyo's father Fujimoto is a much more complexly portrayed character. At the start of the movie, he is the closest thing we have to an antagonist. Ghibli films rarely have one, and true to form, Fujimoto isn't actually an evil father who wishes to cage his daughter for nefarious reasons. What's interesting about Fujimoto is that he is in many ways a voice of reason in the film. He's the only person who openly acknowledges the harmful impact humans are having on the environment, and particularly the ocean. We see the evidence early on in the film when Ponyo first comes to the surface and is immediately met by the rampant pollution by the water's edge and a fishing boat which nearly captures her and is presumably going to spell the death of her fellow sea creatures. No one else verbally talks about this problem other than Fujimoto, who's the only one prescient enough to see how humanity's behavior is going to cause the downfall of our planet. He in fact admits that he used to be a human being, but has forsaken that part of his past because he despises how human beings are always destructive and selfish. You could say he is the voice of a climate extremist, someone who perceives the problem accurately but believes the only solution is the complete wiping out of humanity in order to remedy the situation. But here's where Ghibli and Disney operate so differently. In The Little Mermaid, Ursula is rather brutally impaled and killed, and through her death, order is restored to the world and everyone can go on happily ever after. In Ponyo and Ghibli films in general, conflict is never resolved this way. Even in what Miyazaki set out to specifically be a kids' film, the message isn't simply that good and evil are these binary forces that must do battle till one rises up and wins. No, the message is that you can actually bring someone to your side by showing them a better way. When Grandma Mare, a sea goddess and Ponyo's mother, tells Fujimoto that they can fix the climate disaster if they conduct an old ritual that makes Ponyo human, Fujimoto is initially against the idea. The ritual will only work if Sosuke truly loves Ponyo, and if he doesn't, Ponyo will turn to sea foam. Of course, Fujimoto doesn't want this. But in the end, by showing his devotion and love for Ponyo, Sosuke is able to win over Fujimoto, who shakes his hand and asks for his forgiveness. This is a theme that you see throughout Ghibli films and is something I've talked about in previous videos discussing the structure of Ghibli films and why I love them. Miyazaki's films are never about good overcoming evil, but about good and evil existing in all of us. The solution to disharmony isn't violence, but love and seeking out understanding. Similarly, while Disney tends to feature a lot of absent or dead or disapproving parents, Ghibli films are usually full of loving, supportive parents. So even if Fujimoto starts off antagonistic, there's also Grandma Mare who is supportive, and of course Lisa, who is the most loving and caring mother, even if she's a somewhat reckless driver. Even Koichi, Sosuke's dad, who is never present with him on screen, is super proud and affectionate towards his son, spending time bragging about him to his friend on the ship that he's stationed on. And if you expand it even further and we talk about supportive adult figures, we have the old ladies at the nursing home who all love and root for Sosuke. Even Toki, who is a little grumpy and prickly at the beginning, risks life and limb to protect Sosuke at the end. Disney films, by contrast, and The Little Mermaid as an example, almost never feature adult figures who help our heroes, and usually only make their lives harder. Grimsby, Eric's only adult figure, is neither here nor there. He doesn't hinder Eric, but he also doesn't do anything to help Eric's desires. You could consider Sebastian an adult, and he is helpful to Ariel, but beyond him, it's either young, helpful friends or antagonistic adults. I think that's the sentiment I want to conclude this video on, because while there are lots of minor differences we could continue to go on talking about, these big philosophical choices are what separate the two animation houses and the ethos of the films they make. Disney has a certain formula, and it likes to keep things simple. Girl meets boy, they fall in love, stupid adults get in the way, and an evil villain will try and pull them apart through nefarious, underhanded schemes. But just as everything looks lost, some magical intervention saves the day, and in the end, we walk off into the sunset together happily. This formula is obviously effective because it's worked to make Disney one of the biggest companies in the world. But for me, personally, I prefer the way Studio Ghibli does things. They too have recurring themes throughout their films that you could say are the Ghibli formula, but they tend to be so much more admirable to me. Bold and brave young characters, like Disney, but supportive and understanding adults too. Antagonistic figures, sure, but not evil people. Just people who don't see things the way you do, but can be brought around and even become your friends if you approach them with an open mind and love in your heart. And if I want children to watch a film and take one message over the other, I know which kind of world I'd want people to grow up trying to create. Thank you for watching this video. If you've watched this far, then I reckon you'd like some of the other videos on this channel too, so please do check them out. I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons whose names you see on screen right now. Without support from viewers like you, I would not be able to make the content I make, so thank you so very much, and I hope you'll consider joining my Patreon if you aren't already a member. Also, as I said, check out our Discord, my Twitch stream, or just drop a comment about what piece of media you'd like to see me analyze next. That's it for now. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.